There is a category of creatures in this world that have been spotted by a few, but have never been proven to exist. We collectively refer to these creatures as unidentified mysterious animals, unconfirmed biological entities, abbreviated as UMA. Hello everyone, welcome to the UMA video series. The White Nile is one of the two main tributaries of the Nile in Africa. In a broad sense, it refers to all sections from Lake Victoria, flowing through Lake Kyoga, to Lake Albert. The complex waterways and vast marshy wetlands have formed one after another inaccessible wilderness areas. Local indigenous people say that in these endless stretches of water lives a giant monster. It is even larger and more ferocious than the biggest python. And that is our theme for today, the water monster from the folklore of the White Nile Basin, the Lao. Or a giant catfish, living in the vast Sud swamps of Sudan. Regarding the origin of the name Lao, I have not found a definitive explanation, only that the local Dinka, Nuer, and Shilluk tribes all use this term to refer to this monster. In 1929, in Sir Ray Huffman's Newer English Dictionary, the word law was used to denote a type of giant and fearsome aquatic animal, described as now extinct and possibly a mythical creature. The earliest written record we can find regarding this creature comes from the 1923 edition of Sudan Notes and Records, written by the then Anglo-Egyptian Sudanese government official, Henry Jackson, in his translated text on the Nuer people of the Upper Nile province. In the appendix at the end of the article, there is such a description. It is said that there are two distinct types of pythons in the Nuer region. One inhabits abandoned termite mounds, large enough to swallow a bushbuck or a gazelle. The other is an amphibious animal, between 12 to 20 feet in length, capable of devouring a whole sheep or goat. I also heard a third legend about a great serpent that the Nuer have always feared, which might be a creature of their imagination. The Nuer and Dinka call this serpent the Lao, to distinguish it from another giant serpent, known as the Nile by the Shilluk people. Its size is incredibly vast and thick, exceeding 40 feet in length, overall light brown or dark yellow in color. Between its belly and tail, there is a protrusion about 3 inches long and 2 fingers wide. On the ground where it has traveled, gullies left by its passage can be seen. There are 4 independent bones on each side of the lower jaw, about 4 inches long. Its actual skeletal structure is very similar to a python. Once these bone fragments are found, people will carefully treasure them for good luck. Its bones are regarded as treasures to ward off evil speech. Some say there is a short tuft of crest hair on the back of the Lao's head. Others say it has long hair, used to entangle prey and drag them into the river. Even its belly will, like an elephant, emit a rumbling sound. Some cases seem to indicate that people have actually seen this creature. For example, in 1914, in the Adar Swamp, a complete giant serpent skeleton was divided among the Nuer people. In the early 20th century, in the western town of Waa, a 40-foot individual was discovered. It was killed by local natives. Later, some even offered human sacrifices to it. It is not uncommon in the Bahr el Arab swamps, and can also be found in the Bahr el Ghazal. The Lao is endowed with various magical properties. The Nuer say the Lao's gaze symbolizes death. If it sees humans first, then those people will be killed. Conversely, if someone sees the Lao first, they can remain safe. This snake spends most of its time in rivers or caves on the banks of swamps. People fear it deeply. As long as they see gullies indicating its presence on the ground, they flee in the opposite direction at maximum speed. Stories of this creature are found across the Bahr el Arab, the Adar swamps, Bahr el Ghazal, and other distant places. In all records, the description of the Lao's color, jaw, and body size are surprisingly consistent. In 1924, British author John Millay mentioned in his book, Far Away Up the Nile, that he specifically traveled to Morocco to interview a police officer named Stevens, who was a veteran old hunter and responsible for managing a large section of telegraph lines on the east bank of the Nile, so he frequently contacted local indigenous people. The article was directly based on Stevens' oral account. Generally speaking, the Lao described by Stevens was not much different from Jackson's account. Only, the upper limit of the creature's size expanded to 100 feet, and it was mentioned to be as thick as a horse, with giant tentacles or stiff hairs on its tongue, used to grasp prey, and this animal is very rare. A company employee named Abraham Mohammed, in a village called Burqa, had seen a killed Lao. Here, Stevens also mentioned the individual killed by the Shilluk in the Hadar swamps, and stated he had the honor of obtaining some of the creature's vertebrae, and gave them to Jackson, who sent them to the British Museum for identification, but did not receive a satisfactory explanation. An Azand man from Paw named Leba Lembi also reported having seen a similar monster killed in a nearby swamp. Additionally, Stevens met a Belgian administrative officer in Rejaf on the west bank of the White Nile, who was very convinced of the Lao's existence, because he had once seen one of these giant serpents in a swamp and fired at it several times, but the bullets were ineffective. When that monster entered deeper waters, it would leave a massive trail in the swamp. In 1937, British colonial administrator William Hickins, in his published article, African Mystery Beasts, stated that the Lao and Laquata are likely the same animal, from the screeching night calls, the humans, and characteristics like the mythological nature of their remains. The two are very similar. Regarding the Laquata content, you can check my earlier videos. At the same time, Hickins also provided a photograph of a wood carving of the Lao's head. The owner of the carving was an artist from Kremf, Msimbiti in the Aramba district of Singida province, Tanzania, but I myself lack the insight to truly distinguish how this photo reflects the shape of the Lao's head. In 1939, British author Frank Lane mentioned in Nature's Parade that Hickins sent him a letter containing this photograph, and mentioned that in his youth, Msimbiti had traveled and hunted around the Lake Victoria marshes and the Nile wetlands. When Hickins suggested that the Lao did not exist, he retorted, "When I was young and ignorant, I might have said your motor cars did not exist, because at that time I had neither seen. But now, that car is parked right before my eyes. I have even ridden in it and listened to the sound of its engine running." It is the same with the legend of the Lao. In 1955, cryptozoologist Bernard Heuvelmans, in his book On the Track of Unknown Animals, detailed information related to the Lao. As the article spread, he received more feedback from informed personnel. In 1959, the renowned Sudanese administrator Thomas Owen wrote to Heuvelmans, reporting a similar experience, and in 1960 recorded this description in his book Hunting Big Game, with gun and camera. In the 6th chapter of the book, it is mentioned, among many creature legends related to the Sud, the Lao has always lacked first-hand witnesses, at least those surviving eyewitnesses. It has been assigned multiple identities, possibly a brontosaurus, a crocodile, a giant mysterious anaconda, a bizarrely sized mamba, or a product of hallucination and superstition. The Dinka people fear an animal named Yak and Yong. This creature only inhabits certain parts of the Sud, and its distribution areas are far apart. Although people do not exclude activities in these waters, they always avoid those specific places. The Yak and Yong is often about 3 miles long, with tentacles up to 1/4 mile long. It can prey on swimming objects and also attack canoes, carrying off humans, but it is more accustomed to drowning prey, sucking them dry of blood, and letting the corpses float or be washed ashore. The creature's most frequent haunt is undoubtedly a stretch of the Bahr el Arab. This river separates the Bahr el Ghazal from Kordofan to its north. On a sweltering day in early March, Owen and British officers from both provinces, Dinka chiefs, Arab elders, and dozens of tribe members camped and rested under the shade on the north bank. Seeing a flock of teal swimming across the water, his colleague Bob shot and hit one. The duck flapped 6 or 7 times and stopped in the middle of the stream. Bob took off his clothes and jumped into the water, intending to swim over and retrieve. Having swam just a short distance, Owen noticed his expression suddenly became anxious, and he stopped moving. Then he shouted, "There's something over there." A moment later, he cried out, "My God, I've got to get out of here." Then he sank below the water. Owen had to jump in with his clothes on to assist. He swam back to the shore, but the Dinka boy, who was previously with them, had already fled. Half an hour later, the chief arrived and marveled at their luck, stating that 3 days ago, that thing had carried off one of their soldiers. At this time, on the opposite bank, there still lay the carcass of a bull slaughtered to appease the water monster. According to Owen, the legendary records here, which lack scientific basis and are vague, are often one-sided and exaggerated through word of mouth. Interestingly, these perceptions are based on experience. Africans rarely invent entirely fictitious creatures from imagination. The Dinka have a thorough understanding of crocodiles and would never confuse them with other creatures. As for the legend, he would maintain an open attitude, ready at any time to consider evidence of the Lau's existence in the future. Cryptozoologist Bernard Heuvelmans supported William Hickens' view, believing the Lau and Lakwata should belong to the same category of animal, since East African lakes are mostly connected via the White Nile to the swamps at the source of the Nile. Remains of both animals were used to create amulets with the same magical properties. Its notoriety seems to extend to the parts of the Congo closest to that region. He believed that compared to a giant python, the Lau and Lakwata should be identified as a type of giant catfish, as all descriptions of the Lau seem contradictory when applied to a single species itself. The common tribal name used by Jackson, the word Lau, may in fact be inaccurate. As mentioned above, the Nile of the Shilluk people and the Yak and Yong, feared by the Dinka in Owen's writing. These various distinctions might mean that Lau is actually a collective term for a certain class of animals, such as unknown large aquatic animals. Most eyewitness reports can be explained by fish. Heuvelmans lean toward the Lau being some kind of giant catfish. Currently, the largest catfish species known in southern Africa is the Heterobranchus longiphilis, also known as the Vundu catfish. The largest individual found reached 1.5 meters in length and weighed 55 kilograms. Looking at its appearance, these four pairs of prominent whisker structures can indeed allow one to imagine the long hair characteristics described by people. Then there is the Nile bichir. This is an ancient fish species endemic to Africa, from the Nile to the Congo Basin, to West African countries like Senegal. Their traces are found across Africa, overall gray in color, characterized by a row of neatly arranged dorsal finlets and diamond-shaped ganoid scales, used to protect themselves from predators. The largest known but unconfirmed individuals reach a body length of 1.2 meters. Professor Heuvelmans believed the protrusions on the bichir's back might be mistaken by people for the Lau's head crest, and the African catfish, namely Clarius garipinus, to swim on land during droughts, possesses an auxiliary respiratory organ that can directly inhale air. Its air sac can emit an audible rumbling sound. This could explain the Lau's vocalization phenomenon and the mythologized description of death upon being seen by the Lau. This terrifying description might originate from the current released by electric catfish. Although for humans, there is no direct life-threatening danger, it is sufficient to cause shock and panic. Additionally, the African lungfish might also cause this confusion because they burrow into the mud under swamps when estivating and show obvious aggression when startled. But clearly, no single fish can fully explain the Lau's characteristic descriptions. Moreover, the known maximum sizes of these catfish cannot rival the legendary water monster. But the professor believed, considering the body size development of catfish in Eurasia and the Americas, 311, as yet undiscovered, exists in African swamps. Overall, personally, I believe the Lau likely originates from human misunderstanding. Based on known information, the core contradiction lies in the vast and highly consistent folklore, against the almost total lack of indistinguishable physical evidence. Furthermore, the Lao and Lakwada still have significant differences in their specific physical descriptions. The latter is more like some massive aquatic or amphibious reptile, based purely on the description of the Lao itself. I can only think of the South African python, because according to explorers' records, locals distinguish this thing from ordinary pythons, but describe it as an even larger snake. Considering that in recent years, the size limits of some reptiles are constantly being updated. Plus, when witnessing underwater or partially submerged creatures, light refraction and visual errors. Moreover, snakes, in most parts of Africa, are regarded as like the Luo people around Lake Victoria, who fear snakes, believing them to be symbols of evil. While in Jaba, Nigeria, snakes are seen as the wealth of the gods. Anyone who harms them must be punished, or even put to death. Well, the truth about the Lao remains an unsolved mystery to this day, whether it is a real animal or a product of the collision between colonial and indigenous cultures. At least its story adds a touch of lingering mystery to those endless marshlands, and gives meaning to those who later pursue this UMA. Finally, as always, the unknown will always be greater than the known. That is the charm of UMA. That's it for this video. Thank you for watching.